waiting a little bit for the rest of the participants to join us. But so again, I've been the Associate Curator of Decorative Arts for about 2 years now. And we just want to welcome you to our virtual museum since we're not able to go there together in person. Here we are online. And I think we have a few more people coming in. It looks like we have a good crowd. And I hope you're all well and that all of you and your families are safe and together. And we just want to give you an escape and a way to look at some art and think about the Ballantine House at the museum. And so as people join us, before I introduce our speaker today, who many of you may already know, I just want to say we'll have about a 20-minute presentation. And then we'll have about a 20-minute question and answer session. So for those of you on Zoom, please use on the bottom bar, you can put in your questions in the Q&A tab. And for those of you joining us on Facebook Live, use the comment field. And so at the end, I'll be able to ask Ulysses your questions. And so for those of you, many of you already know him, but for those of you who don't, I just want to give a brief introduction. For 38 years, Ulysses Grant Dietz was in various forms, always the Curator of Decorative Arts, but also Chief Curator, interim co-director, and now for the past 2 years, he's been Chief Curator Emeritus, and always a great resource and generous with his knowledge and perspective on the decorative arts collections in the Ballantine House. Ulysses has, over his years here at the museum, built the collection both physically and also has made a name for the museum and the decorative arts collection nationally and internationally. And he was also instrumental in the major restoration and interpretation of the Ballantine House in 1994. So without further ado, Ulysses, it's always a pleasure and welcome.
Great to be here, Amy. It's lovely to see your face. We communicate a lot by email because we've stayed close since my retirement, and I really miss coming to the museum in person, but it's lovely to be able to, I've participated in these before, so it's great to be here, and I think we're going to have fun wandering through the Ballantine House, and I'll try to stay coherent.
I'll keep my eye on my watch.
So do I just start?
I think you can just join right in, and then Sylvia will advance the slides as you need.
Well, let's start with the first slide then, because I think this is a slide. This is an image when I first discovered it a long time ago in the museum's archives. It was thrilling because this picture, if you were to stand in the same spot today, the only two buildings that are still there are the John and Jeanette Ballantine House, which is right in the middle, and the spire to the left, St. Patrick's Pro Cathedral, built in 1850, the first Catholic cathedral in New Jersey, are still there. Everything else is gone. The surroundings are entirely different. But the museum is also right there too. But what you're looking at is the John in the center and the Robert Ballantine houses as they looked in about 1890, about 5 years after they were both built. Washington Park had been a sort of exclusive residential neighborhood since the early 19th century. But it had been a park. Washington Park had been a park since the 17th century. And people had been living on this park, which was the marketplace in colonial Newark since the 18th century. It was named for George Washington in 1799, when he died. And it had become this very fashionable uptown residential area by the end of the 19th century. So John Ballantine and his brother Robert rented houses and then purchased houses side by side on this park in the 1870s. And then in the 1880s, after their father died and left them money and control of the brewery in Newark, Robert had his house completely redone, and John had his house and another house torn down, build the new house that you see here. So you're looking at these houses when they were pretty much brand new. And right next to them, which is now where the Newark Museum is, to the left, downtown, was the Marcus Ward House. He had been the governor of New Jersey and was a very powerful colonial family descendant in Newark, and that house was torn down to build the Newark Museum in the 1920s. But I won't get into all the details of the neighborhood because that's a rabbit hole that would take us all morning. But why don't we go to the next slide? So this is to show you, this is one of those things I love that's in the Newark Museum Library. This is one of these huge books. It's like 2.5 feet by 3.5 feet, the tax maps. And they were done for all the big cities, all the towns actually all across the United States. But this shows you a bird's eye view looking down on the plot of the Robert and John Ballantine house. John H. Ballantine is our Ballentine, and his brother Robert's house next door. You can see how closely fitted they were. But if you look at the John Ballantine property, all of that is still there. The carriage house is there at the back of the property. It's one of the only intact estates left in the city from that period. But in between the house and the carriage house is the north wing of the Newark Museum. And where Susan L. Ward, the widow of Marcus Ward, where her property is the yellow house, which means a wooden house, that's where the Newark Museum is, in the museum's garden. But Robert and John built these houses next to each other. They were built out of brick, which is why they're tinted pink. They had carriage houses that opened onto what was called Plain Street on the back, now University Avenue, and Washington Street facing the park on the front. And you can also see, if you look, that all the houses along James Street, none of which actually still exist on that block, belonged to the Ballentine family. They owned a lot of property in the neighborhood, and all of which originally belonged to the Ward family in the 17th and 18th centuries. Let's go to the next slide. So John and Robert built their houses side by side. John and his bride, Jeanette, who had been married in the late 1860s, early 1870s, they built houses according to the modes of the day. Now, what I've shown you here on this slide with my rather scribbly lines connecting pictures to the floor plan is the original large-scale 1885 floor plan drawn up by the architect, Edward Harney, who did these presentation drawings for the Ballentine family. And they're one of the most valuable resources in the museum's archives is these documents that the family gave us in the 1940s related to the creation of the house, the building of the house. I happen to love floor plans, and so even though they're a little fuzzy because they're in color, Amy allowed me to keep them in. And because I wanted to show you something that was really important, is that houses in the 19th century, and the Ballentine house is just like all the other houses of its kind all across America. We were a very habit-driven and conformist kind of culture. And of course, they're based on European cultures, mostly English for the Ballentines. But houses were designed in a very specific way to reflect people's values, but also to reflect very simply the way they lived. And what you've got here is you've got the front of the house is at the bottom of the screen. You can see the stone front porch. What you've got basically is a center hall with rooms divided into public and private according to the way the house functioned. The photograph in the center with the white fireplace is the parlor in the Ballentine house as it was redecorated in 1891, but with the woodwork looking the way it did in 1885 when Edward Harney finished the house. And you've got the line that draws you to the space on the floor plan. The parlor was one of those rooms that was, it was the most luxurious, the most opulent room because it was the most public, the most formal, the most expensive. But it also had the worst view and it had no stained glass because it was in fact the room that was the least used in the house at all. It was a public space identified with women, with Mrs. Ballentine and her daughter Alice. It was a room that reflected the family's wealth and at least their hope that people would perceive them as elegant and genteel. Now the other line and the photograph below shows you the library across the hall at the front of the house. The library is another opulent room, and while these two rooms may not look that drastically different to modern eyes, they sent very different messages because the library was the family room. It was private. Certainly public people, guests would go and sit in the library, but you didn't get put in the library unless you were a friend, unless you knew the family and would be put there for reasons of your own comfort. The library is all paneled in cherry, whereas the dining room, the living room, the parlor is painted pine, painted and gilded, so it looks sort of French, but we can go there later. But it is definitely on the family side of the house. The family would have spent more time in the library than in the parlor. And in fact, the Ballantine grandchildren, the young children, I mean, their name was young, they were young also, but they remember spending time with Granny Ballantine in the library. That was in the Victorian era, practically the only room children were allowed in on their own. It was a room where you could sit and read. It's the room where today you would have your computer and your TV screen, but in the olden days, we had books, and there is a music box. So and there's a mandolin that nobody played, but it's in the room, because this was the room where the family gathered for informal family activities, whereas the parlor was formal public activities, always presided over by Mrs. Ballantine and later by her daughter Alice. I think that's enough on this. Well, if you, just by the way, so on the family side, you have the big room at the back, which is the dining room, which was both public and private, dinner parties and family meals. And on the right, ironically, behind the most public room is the most private room, which was the billiard room, which originally when it was built was only for men, but eventually opened up to be for women, because as Alice became a teenager, the family would cut a door from the billiard room into the parlor so that Alice could informally entertain her friends. And I like to imagine that that's how she found her husband, was playing pool in the billiard room. But I did make that up. That's not proven. Let's go to the next slide. It looks like the same slide and it's equally fuzzy, but it shows, I mean, you all have to understand that as a curator who loves architecture, floor plans are like reading music to me. And when you look at this floor plan, the red lines are the brick walls, and the brown lines are the lath and plaster and wooden walls. So this shows you the way the house was articulated in the 19th century. A lot of these walls were removed. At the top of the slide, all of those little partitions were torn out. That was the servants' wing. There were 4 maids' rooms and a governess's room in the servants' wing, and a staircase down to the kitchen. You can see how much smaller they were. For the family, there were 2 sitting rooms and 4 bedrooms. One of the best bedrooms was for the guests. That's at the top left. And you can see handwriting. I'll explain that. The master bedroom was at the bottom right. It was the biggest and best room in the house. It faced east, so it got all the morning sunlight. It is physically the largest room in the house. The bottom left, the front left side, the front south corner of the house was Alice's bedroom. And you can see my scribbly line connects Alice's bedroom with the photograph of the room as it looks today. Alice was 11 years old when they moved into the house. She was the only surviving daughter. The family had 8 children, but 4 of them had already died before the house was built. And Alice at 11 was the princess. She was her mother's beloved child. And you can see on this floor plan, the room opens out into the hall, but it also opened into a large dressing room that Alice had all to herself. And it also opened into a small room behind, which was called the sewing room. But what you don't see on the floor plan, and sort of right where the red line crosses the wall on the floor plan, Mrs. Ballantine added a door before the house was built. So she puts the lines on the floor plan because she wanted a door directly from her little boudoir at the front of the house, her little study, her sitting room, right into her daughter's room. Alice and her mother were very, very close. And in fact, Alice would move into this house at 11 years old and would never leave. I mean, she would go outside, not like today, like all of us now, but she would never move out until her mother died in 1919. So it was a very close relationship. Now, opposite that, across the hall, you can see the other scribbled line is a photograph of the Ballantines' master bedroom. Now, nothing you can see, I'm thinking, oh, that's not quite true, but the furniture we have in the Ballantine house didn't really come from the family. There are things from the family. In fact, the clock and the tatsas, the 2 dishes in dark slate on the mantelpiece, and the picture of Napoleon over the mantelpiece, those came from the house. Those came to us from the family. But everything else are things that came to us from other Newark families or things that I collected as a curator for the house itself. And if you look back at the photograph of Alice's room, the Chinese shelf, the little bric-a-brac shelf on the mantelpiece, that actually belonged to Alice as a teenager and was in the sewing room. She kept it in there as a decoration in that room as she was growing up. We've tried to evoke the difference between mom and dad and the kids, because boys and girls and parents and children were kept separate. Alice is across the hall and linked to her mother. Percy is in fact in the bedroom that was behind the master bedroom. So if you look at the front right corner of the floor plan and go straight back, that was Percy's bedroom. Now, interestingly, the architect designed that as Mr. Ballentine's bedroom and Mrs. Ballentine's bedroom, with a bathroom and dressing rooms in between. But the Ballentines shared a bedroom throughout their married life, which is not typical of upper class, of wealthy people in the period. Privacy is privacy, but privacy in this age we live in right now was also health. If one of husband or wife got sick, they kept into separate bedrooms. You didn't share a bed with someone who was coughing and sneezing. So, but the Ballentines did that because they wanted their little boy, who was only 8 years old, to be in the room closest to them and yet separate from his sister. He would not have shared a bathroom with his sister. He would have shared a bathroom with his mother and father, which is an interesting story in itself. So let's go on to the next slide. One of the things that is, again, amazing about the archives is that the family, they didn't take nearly enough photographs, but they kept the decorating records and the building records for the house. Originally in 1885, they went to a decorator in New York City, and you have to understand this. All the decorators in America were in New York City. If you had a house in San Francisco or Chicago, you hired a decorator from New York City. And this is consistent. It's not until the 20th century that decorators begin to pop up in other cities, because the world of needing a decorator, someone who formally planned your whole interior and provided the furnishings and worked with the architect, that was a new idea, and it was a very luxurious idea. And the Ballentines used a New York decorator that nobody, of course, has ever heard of, but they were very prominent. They crop up all over the country in other houses, D.S. Hess and Company. And there are two images here which are a little blurry, but you can read them just to show you the kind of documentation. On the left is the documentation, the bill for the stained glass throughout the house. And of course, what I've always thought was interesting, the most expensive stained glass is down at the bottom, the library window, which was $460, whereas the enormous window on the staircase, with the windows in the front door, the stained glass windows and the fan light, totally was only $760, and that's a huge amount of square footage. So this kind of documentation from the decorator really helped us understand the house. And on the other side is a second-story bill from the decorator, an estimate from the decorator. And I just wanted to show you the list of rooms. So the guest room, the sewing room, the young ladies' room, that's Alice's room, and they spelled ladies wrong, by the way, and they didn't use an apostrophe. The boudoir, which is Mrs. Ballentine's little study, Mr. and Mrs. B's room, and Master Percy's room. So this is what proved to us how the rooms were used, but it also talks about the way the rooms are decorated, and I could go on and on. I have given 2.5-hour tours of the Ballantine house in my past, so I won't drag you through this, but these documents are incredibly valuable and surprisingly rare in archival collections. Let's have the next slide, please. So I wanted to show you just a couple of rooms from downstairs again, and sort of a transition space. And this is referring really back to the stained glass bill that I showed you on the previous page. The dining room is the least altered of all the rooms. It's the room that needed the least restoration when the house was restored first for the bicentennial in 1976. This, when the museum moved into the house in 1937, was the mail room. This is where the secretary sat, where they sorted the mail. Imagine desks with typewriters, fluorescent light fixtures, but that was all that was left intact. The mahogany paneling, the original wallpaper, the original beautiful stained glass made in Newark by the Belcher Art Glass Company, all of that was here. What you look at in the room here were things from the museum collection, and the dining chairs, which came to us from the family, were given to us by the family. And the one anecdote I have about that is when the furniture was ordered in 1885, there was only one armchair for the dining room. which means for Mr. Ballentine. And very quickly after that, a second one was ordered. So either it was a mistake or somebody objected, and we had 2 chairs for mom and for dad. The way I have it worked here is that Mrs. Ballentine sat at the far end of the table to the left, so she could keep an eye on the servants coming through the pantry door. Oh, and the window, this is the sort of 10 by 14 foot stained glass window made in Newark, we think, by the Belcher Art Glass Company. High up on the staircase, it's a spectacular window. During the daytime, this would have been the only light in the house, so the house would have felt very cathedral-like, very church-like. But it also is a garden. It's a garden in the modern style that is meant to represent an Asian image of a garden, a paradise garden that's a fantasy. And you're thinking, well, if you're up on a stairway, why not look out into the actual garden that was behind? The problem with the Ballentine's garden, which was big and was full of fruit trees, is that there's a hospital on the hill, there's a warehouse, there's workers' housing, there's a lot of unromantic things going on behind the Ballantine house. And when you're up high on the staircase, you can see that. So the window is to create a fantasy view that was not like the actual view. But you've also got the sun setting. On the front door, you have a fan light with the sun rising, and here you have the sun setting. So the house is very much oriented toward the rising and the setting of the sun. The south side of the house, where the family spent most of the time, that's where the sun is all winter long. The sun arcs across the south side of the house. So the architect knew what he was doing, and the stained glass designer knew what he was doing in order to create interiors that suited the location and the lifestyle of the family who lived there. Let's have the next slide. Another thing, I am so happy that there were some photographs that the family gave us that were of the house when it was first opened, because they were enormously helpful in recreating the interiors. In the 1970s when it was first done, and I came here 4 years after it was done, and then in the 1990s when I got to do the second floor. But here you see on the left is a picture of the reception room when the house was first opened. It was a common enough thing for rich people to have their houses photographed, to document the interiors as they looked in the period. But this house changed. What you can see on the current slide of the room, there's this brown imitation leather wallpaper. That was put on in 1900 by Mrs. Ballentine, maybe around the time of Alice's wedding. We don't really know. She was married in this room in 1899. And the brown wallpaper, which is an imitation leather wallpaper made in Germany, almost sort of Art Nouveau in the borders, would have been particularly pragmatic. But what you see on the left slide is the original fabric on the walls in this room, which was green silk, which would have contrasted with the honey yellow maple of the woodwork. It would have been a gorgeous colorway. And then in the doorway, going into the parlor, you can see a grill across the top. That had disappeared. By 1891, those were all removed from the downstairs rooms, but every room had its own different wooden grill. This one was painted gold and white because it reflected the parlor. And actually for many, it still exists. We found it in the attic. And for many years, is it still in your office, Amy? It was in my office for many years because I found it in the attic. But you can see none of the furniture in the photograph on the left is the same as the furniture on the right, but some of the furniture is identical because it's the same form by the same Newark maker, John Jelliff, that came from other families. So we were very fortunate in being able to recreate these interiors from what we had in the collection. You'll notice in the contemporary room that the andirons are the same ones that are in the fireplace in the house in 1885. And in fact, there are two pieces on the mantelpiece. The candelabra and the red glass vase are also in both photographs. The big round dish that's on the wall with the wonderful exotic parrot, that's hanging on the wall because it was a gift to the museum and something I was really thrilled to get. And I put it on that wall to make the donor happy. And you've got to realize curators do that. And I have no regrets because I always thought it looked blank up there. And that's a wonderful piece. But as you'll see, the center table in the current slide is not the same one that's in the old slide, but it's a very similar one from a Newark family. And the lamp in the old slide is not the one in the new slide. but it's the same period and the same kind of lamp. So therefore, we were able to recreate from photographs a room that really looked very much the way it did when it was originally done. Let's go on to the next. And just, and this is our last slide because we want to let you talk and ask questions. But on the left, you see the guest room as it showed up on the floor plan, the big guest room with a niche for the bed. And when we decided to finish the restoration of the house, it had to become the showcase for the idea of all these objects in the decorative arts collection that meant something and came from other people's homes. So the guest room, the last gallery I did before I retired, became the Silver Gallery. And if you aren't interested in silver, you have to come to the museum someday and look at the Silver Gallery, because then you'll understand why I love silver so much and why it was so, so important. So you have sort of, I love this artistic view of the gallery. It's got lots of cool stuff in it, but this big candelabrum in the middle is huge, 30 inches tall, but it's one of a whole group of silver we have that came from a Newark family, but it came from a Newark factory. It was made by Tiffany and Company in 1900 for the Paris World's Fair, the great Exposition Universelle in Paris. And this was purchased out of the exposition by a Newark family and stayed in the family for many years until we acquired it late in my career. So there's a lot of fascinating stories about other houses and other families and other objects that you see when you go into the rooms upstairs. We do have restored Alice's bedroom, the teenage girl's bedroom, Mrs. Ballentine's private space, the boudoir, and the master bedroom. But the other spaces are all galleries to look at the collections in the context of the house and home and what it means. And then this picture on the right is just what I looked like 40 years ago, standing in the parlor of the Ballantine House before I started wearing bow ties and before I gave up on contact lenses. My whole career was involved with this house, and it continues to be one of the most special places in my life. And I'm so glad to be able to present it to you. And I hope you will all come up with difficult and challenging questions for me, and Amy will be able to help me if I get confused. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ulysses. And it's just exciting I learn something new every time. And so we have quite a few questions and comments, and just thinking, I had one from myself. The first, with you ending with the picture of you in 1980, I just wanted to ask a little bit more. You mentioned that the dining room had been where the secretaries and the mail was. When you started, what did the Ballantine House look like, and how was it used then?
So now, when I got to the museum in 1980, the house had been restored outside, and the ground floor, the main floor, had been restored because it was the fancy floor. But the upstairs was still offices. So the ground floor in the 1930s, when we moved in, the library was where the switchboard operator sat. The reception room was called the waiting room. The parlor was called the white room, which was just an office space, but people would sit there too. And the dining room was the mail room.
Oh, wonderful.
So it was all functional. And then you went upstairs, and during the first 10, 15 years of my career, the master bedroom was the director's office. The boudoir was his secretary's office. And I remember Mary McGill, who was the director's secretary, who was lovely. And that's when I went and introduced myself to her my first day at work. That Alice's bedroom was the deputy director's office. The guest room was the membership office. And Percy's bedroom was the finance office. So that's where I would go to get my paycheck. So when you gave tours in the Ballantine House, people couldn't walk up the stairs, but you could hear typewriters. For those of you typewriters actually made quite a lot of noise. And the one Xerox machine in the museum was up in the service wing where the mailroom was. So it was all totally functional as a museum offices. And that all got swept away in 1989 when we built the new complex or added the new buildings.
Wonderful.
And then I got the house to restore.
Wonderful. Well, it's amazing to think about how after the Ballantines used it, it continued to be used as office space, and we're so lucky to be able to revert it to making the period and the gallery rooms open to the public. And there's still 2 offices on the 3rd floor, so it's still.
That's right. We've got the whole 3rd floor. We still use it. You know, I realized the house was a house for 35 years, but it's been an institutional building for 100 years.
Right.
So it's and I think we've done a good job with it.
I think so. So I could go on for hours just about this, but I want to give some of our listeners and our viewers questions. You have a hello from Portugal, and Jennifer, I'm just going to read them in order of questions. Jennifer wants to know, what do you think the significance of the Napoleon portrait is in the master bedroom?
Oh, no one's ever asked me that. That belonged to the Ballantines. They had quite a few things related to Napoleon. And what you have to sort of understand about the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, when America was becoming the richest country in the world, Americans loved Napoleon. The White House was redecorated, inspired by interiors that Napoleon left behind at the Chateau de Compiègne in France. I mean, we sent a commission there to look at it, as if Napoleon was somehow a symbol of American democracy. I've never quite understood that. But see, Napoleon represented the sort of self-made man, the go-getter, the man who made things happen. And Americans loved him. You have Napoleonic rooms all over the country in big fancy houses. And the Ballantines had a number of Napoleonic things, some of which are still in the collection. The picture in the master bedroom, I have no idea where they would have put that, but I put it there because it shows a very, very young Napoleon before he became successful and famous. He was Corsican and from an aristocratic family, but he was nobody until he became the emperor of France and tried to take over the world. So it's a very good question, but Americans loved Napoleon.
Okay, well, thank you. And when people are able to visit, we do have a whole Napoleon curio cabinet in the parlor. But moving on to the next question, Anna wants to know, is it true that the beds were short because people sleep sitting up during the 19th century? And possibly because lying flat or laying flat equated illness?
Okay, 2 answers to that, yes and no. The beds are not short. The beds are tall. The Ballantines master bedroom bed is 8.5 feet tall, and it is exactly because there's a queen size mattress, and then that's padded out because it's bigger than a queen size bed. So 2 grown-ups could sleep lying down perfectly happily. By the 1880s and 90s, people are sleeping lying down more because there indeed was in the 18th century and earlier a fear of lying flat because you couldn't breathe. They were worried about, I'm trying to think the word for it, miasma. Exactly. That you somehow, and they were not wrong. I mean, if I have a cold, I have to sit up. So I prop myself up on pillows to sleep sitting up because your sinuses drain and you breathe easier when you're sitting up. Even though I think, and doctors figured that out millennia ago. So I think that's why, but the beds, generally speaking, are not smaller. A big Victorian bed is going to be almost a queen size. I actually have a Victorian bed at home and it's got a queen size mattress. So so that's a bit of a myth. People were shorter too, but not that much.
Right. Okay, well, and I wanted to move on because several people have commented on the beauty of the handwriting on the Hess invoices. And someone else wants to know about the lighting. How would it have worked at various points? Was it gas to begin with, or when did it become electric?
Okay, 2 good questions. Handwriting, what you're looking at on those invoices is a secretary's handwriting. In the days before typewriters, and in fact, some of the documents related to the house are typed. The builder's specs are all typed, so typewriters existed. But for an elegant business, all of the invoices were written out by hand, and you had to have remember cursive writing? You had good secretary's handwriting was a must for a business. You had to have that. But as to the lighting, the house originally was all lit with gas. It did have an electric alarm system for security with a battery. But in 1899, the house was wired for electricity for Alice and her husband, Henry, who moved into a brand new room built on the top of the house on the 3rd floor. So the house was electric and gas together for a while, and then eventually it was all electric.
Right. Okay, thank you. And then on a different note, I have someone from Facebook Live wanting to know about what happened with the children, that not all of them survived. So how many children were there and how many grew up to adulthood?
Amy and I were just talking about that yesterday, because up in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Newark, which is a great Victorian cemetery, there's a huge red granite obelisk for the Ballantines, and around it, all of the family members who are buried there, including their first child, who is simply listed on a little marble plaque as our firstborn, so probably died at birth. Child mortality was huge in the 19th century, and Newark, as it got more and more urban, got dirtier and dirtier. By the time the Ballantines built the house, the mortality rate, oh boy, now I've forgotten these statistics, but it was extraordinarily high. And even though poor children died at a higher rate than rich children, all children were vulnerable because there were no medicines that could cure anything, really. So the Ballantines were married in around 1870. They had 4 children, one of whom died at birth, and then 3 other daughters, all of whom died before Alice was born in 1874. And we don't know what they died of, but diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, mumps, a cold. You could get a cold and die of pneumonia. I must admit, in this day and age, we're all very conscious of things like that. But there was nothing you could do for these diseases. Right. Aspirin wasn't invented until the 1890s to lower fever and lessen inflammation. So you were very vulnerable for almost anything. And that's one reason why people had big families. Sorry, that's my landline ringing.
Right.
Oh, it stopped. Good.
Well, and we could go on for hours about that, but I want to honor some of these other questions. Sure. And so someone wanted to ask about the wall covering in the dining room, and wanted to know, is it true that it's indestructible? And can you tell us anything about the company that made the dining room wallpaper?
Well, it's not really indestructible, but it sure has lasted. That wallpaper is an extraordinarily rare survival. It is an artificial material made out of linseed oil and sawdust, basically. There was a brand name in England called Lincrusta, which was used in more modest houses well into the 20th century. But this was very specifically what was called a Japanese leather paper that was made in Japan for a German company in 1884, advertised, which is why we know what it was, the same pattern and everything. It was extraordinarily expensive. The wallpaper in the dining room cost as much as the mahogany woodwork in the dining room. So, and then it would evolve into vinyl wallpaper, because what happens is this material out of sawdust and linseed oil polymerizes chemically over the years. So what you've got on the walls in the dining room now is basically sheets of plastic. So it's actually waterproof, and it's not indestructible because you could break it quite easily, but it has survived, and it's sort of an amazing survival, and they left it up. I mean, I can't believe we didn't just rip it down, and I'm so glad it survived, because it's really rare. It may be the only intact example of this pattern known.
Wow. And then thinking about the dining room, someone wanted to know about the ceiling in the dining room, and also what kind of gold paint was used in the parlor. So.
Not gold paint.
Right.
That's 2 good questions. The ceiling in the dining room, which I don't think even shows up, but it's sort of modern technology meets high decorator pretension, because it has these mahogany beams, this grid of beams in the dining room, dividing it into coffers, and into those coffers are set panels of cast paper mache, which was a lot lighter. I mean, it's cast by hand, but it's a lot lighter weight than plaster, so it's not straining the beams. And then it's gilded and painted with a bronze varnish to make it look old. So that's modern technology and old design.
Okay, and then I have someone wanting to know, do we have in the silver gallery or anywhere in the house, is there any silver from the Ballentine family?
Silver from the Ballentine family?
I can't remember any silver.
I don't think so. I don't think we have any family silver. We have a little silver vase or something that's in the dining room.
Right.
That someone gave us, not the family, that supposedly came from the Ballentines.
Right.
But we don't have any of the Ballentine's flatware. I mean, the family, there's a lot of people out there
Right.
named
So the family
Valentine,
has to have it.
and they didn't want to give us everything they owned.
Right. And thinking about the Ballantine family, can you tell us just briefly what their family business was, and are they still in Newark?
They are not still in Newark, and I'm not even sure. The brand may sort of exist, but Peter Ballantine and Sons was, when the house was built, the biggest brewery in the United States. It would soon be outstripped by Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, Missouri, which still has a brewery in Newark, ironically. But the Ballantine brand disappeared in the 1960s.
Okay.
Why do I have to get a coughing fit in the middle of all this?
Right. Well, and I have so many different questions, so I want to honor everyone. To the listeners, I want to say, if we're not able to answer all of the questions, I will try to answer them afterwards and ask Ulysses
We'll email you later.
Really interesting. There were two questions I think we have time for. One, several people are asking about the portraits and the paintings, and one specifically asked, were they the Ballantines? Does it reflect their choices? Were they selected by the decorator or part of your interpretation plan?
Well, there's one painting in the house by a French artist named Jerome that's in the reception room, a little painting.
Mm-hmm.
But all the portraits and things are curatorial choices.
Right.
But people did collect portraits, ancestor portraits. The Ballantines had no ancestry. Peter Ballantine was dirt poor when he got here in the early 19th century.
Right.
The Ballantines were first generation big money. And there are portraits of John and Jeanette Ballantine that are really beautiful by a very expensive artist. We have all the bills and everything.
Right.
And Mrs. Ballantine still hangs on the staircase. Mr. Ballantine's in storage for a while we fix something on the wall. And so, but all those portraits, I mean, people joke about buying ancestors, but people bought old portraits because they were an art form that were valued. The portrait in the dining room is actually of a Scottish nobleman who the Ballantines would have hated. or no, an English nobleman who betrayed the Scottish. The Ballantines would have hated him, so that's a joke.
Right,
But
so they're all good curatorial jokes in the background. And let's see, I'm so sorry that I can't answer everyone's questions, but I know we're on a time limit. So I do have one fascinating question. And I'm getting a note here that yes, for everyone who wants a tour of the second floor or another tour, we will make that possible. There's been a lot of audience requests. So I think I'm saying yes from you, Ulysses. But I'm okay, I found it. Sorry, I'm doing multitasking here. So for the audience, yes, I believe we can request that Ulysses gives us a second tour. And for our final question of the day, can you discuss the disconnect between the exterior of the mansions being rather plain and the interiors being very opulent? And does the thinking of Manhattan, the uptown growth of Fifth Avenue, change this across the country? So that could be an hour, but I'll give you a minute or two.
Well, I would say the house is rather plain on the outside. And I've always thought that, the house kind of disappoints me on the outside because it's a big box. And the architect tried to vary the windows, and they're bay windows. And, he's pretty smart, but it's a tight lot. And it's in a very conservative neighborhood. What you've got to realize is the people who live next door to the Ballantines have lived in Newark for 200 years. The Ballantines managed to find themselves a piece of land in the most exclusive, restricted, waspy neighborhood in Newark. They were surrounded by people whose ancestors had been here before the Ballantines were in America, had been in Newark since before. And they, I think, were just, quite frankly, sucking up to the old guard by building a very conservative house. The big beer brewer, Gottfried Kröger, in the German neighborhood up on the hill, built this wild turreted castle, and he was not richer than John Ballantine, but he had no hope, being a German Catholic, of getting into the old WASP hierarchy. And the Ballantines were there to marry off their children into the old families, and they did that. So the house is bland on the outside because it suited the tone of the neighborhood.
Right, don't want to make waves and don't want to Right. Well, this is fascinating. I could go on for hours talking with you one-on-one, and also on behalf of all of our wonderful participants, I apologize to those of you who I wasn't able to answer your questions, but we will try to follow that up later. And,
Sure.
and I just have a few housekeeping notes, but most of all, I really want to thank you for your time, Ulysses, and all of your work.
Great.
Giving me a wonderful foundation to carry on. And so thank you. And I want to thank all of our audience. I'm imagining all of you out there. And next week, our Lunch and Learn will be with our former curator of the Arts of Global Africa, Krista Clark. So look at our website under programs, and if you're a member, you should receive a mailing. But noon next week, Lunch and Learn, and we'll also be on Facebook Live again. And then this Saturday, the 25th at 3 p.m., also available. If you go to our website under programs and under special events, you'll see we have a roundtable with concerns for the local Newark artist community, as well as the greater regional, that the museum is working with Newark Arts, but the Newark Museum of Art really wants to support our local cultural community and artists. So thinking about the concerns, challenges, and ways to move forward in this current coronavirus situation. So please feel free to join in for that roundtable. And most of all, thank you everyone for all your support and interest in the Newark Museum of Art, and especially today, the Ballantine House. And thank you again, Ulysses.